Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today is the 19th anniversary of the Sabra and Shatila massacres, which occurred in Lebanon in 1982. A couple times in this video I say that this incident happened 19 years ago. It actually was 29. For some reason I was counting back from 2001. So it occurred 29 years ago today. I wanted to give a little bit of background to the story for people who are not familiar with this massacre and how and why it was carried out. When the Palestinians had to leave their land, they became refugees in many different countries, including Lebanon, and the major influxes of Palestinian refugees occurred in 1948 and 1967 and also in the 1970s. So by the time of 1982, there was a large population of Palestinian refugees living in Lebanon. The Palestinian influx disrupted the balance of power that existed in Lebanon between the Sunnis, Shiites, and the Christians. The Palestinians are primarily Sunni, whereas the majority of Muslims in Lebanon are Shiite. So the Palestinians, they formed armed resistance groups, and they were attempting to find ways to regain the land that they had lost in Palestine. And in order to fight those groups, Israel occupied Lebanon in 1982. And there was a massive bombing campaign in southern Lebanon and Beirut, which killed at least 20,000 people of all kinds, not just Palestinians. So when they occupied Lebanon, the PLO made an agreement with Israel that their men of fighting age would leave the area, mostly to Tunisia. In exchange, Israel guaranteed that the people they were leaving behind would be protected. They had been also fighting with the Christian militia, or militias perhaps, in Beirut. The Christian militia was called Al-Kata'ib, or they're also known in English as the Phalangists. So they needed to be protected from the Phalangists who they had been fighting with. So when Israel occupied after the PLO withdrew, they took control of the refugee camps, and the Phalangists entered the camps and murdered every single inhabitant of Sabra and Shatila refugee camps. Robert Fisk, who was a journalist covering hostilities in Lebanon, arrived at the scene before all of the bodies were cold, and he witnessed the Israeli forces standing guard around the camp. Now, an independent investigation conducted by Israel concluded that the defense minister at the time, who was Ariel Sharon, bore direct responsibility for what happened, and they recommended that he be removed from public office and never allowed to serve again. Prime Minister Begin, who was Prime Minister at the time, he refused to release him from his job, and Israel voted him into office in 2001. Now, I just also wanted to give a little bit more history about the Lebanese Civil War. I'm not an expert on Lebanese history, but I have read a lot about it. And the major cause of the Civil War were the Palestinian refugees and the disruption of the power balance. Israel aligned with the Christians of Lebanon, primarily the Phalangist militia, and also there was a Christian militia in southern Lebanon known as the Southern Lebanese Army. And after occupying Beirut, Israel withdrew from Beirut, and they continued to occupy southern Lebanon up to the the Litani River. And interestingly, the Shiites, when the Israeli army invaded, there were many of them who welcomed the invasion of Israel because they had had problems with the Palestinians in the area, and they had been involved in some skirmishes, and there had been some theft and things like that because the groups were armed. And so they welcomed the Israelis. However, they quickly found that the Israelis did not distinguish between Palestinian and Lebanese, and all were oppressed severely, and there were a lot of deaths and killings that happened. So Hezbollah was mainly created in reaction to the Israeli occupation, and in 2000 they forced the withdrawal of Israel from Lebanon. And at this time, Hezbollah is not a terrorist organization, although its roots did have some relation to things that you might call terrorism, such as the bombing of the Beirut, the American forces that were in Beirut. And they also did use suicide bombing, but not against civilians. They used it against Israeli military because those were the people living in occupying southern Lebanon. They didn't bring in any civilians. Fortunately for the Lebanese, they have not had to deal with settlers. And the kidnapping of Western journalists and citizens, that would probably be the best if you wanted to point to crimes that were committed by groups that later became Hezbollah, but were not under the current leadership. So, where was I? Today, Hezbollah is a nationalist resistance group which has aligned with a group of Christians and a group of Sunnis. Most of the Christians and the Sunnis are in opposition to Hezbollah. The Christian group, which is most antithetical or most, what's the word I'm looking for? Most against Hezbollah, has close connections to the Phalangist militia that was involved in the Civil War and which carried out the massacres of Sabra and Shatila. And today, recently, the Hezbollah-led coalition has taken control of Lebanon. And I just wanted to mention, if you listen to Hassan Nasrallah, who is the leader of Hezbollah, his speeches are very nationalist, and Israel helped to unite many of the Palestinians with the Shiites. In 2006, when they invaded Lebanon, or tried to, they didn't get very far, the Hezbollah was very popular all over the Muslim world, despite the fact that they're Shiite and the majority of Muslims are Sunni. And there is a lot of fear-mongering about Iran. And, of course, Hezbollah is funded and its patron is Iran. So, in spite of that, people at the time, especially even a lot of Palestinians in Lebanon, stand firmly behind Hezbollah, and a lot of Palestinians also do as well. Anyway, there are many Christians in southern Lebanon. People don't realize that because most of the Christians do live in the north. But when I was in Lebanon, there were local elections. I was in the south, which is mainly Shia. And the two main parties were Hezbollah and Harak-e-Adamah, which are both Shiite groups. But in the city that I was in, Hezbollah was running a Christian woman on their ticket. And they have a lot of Christian allies in Lebanon. So Hezbollah is not best defined as an Islamist group. It's best defined as a nationalist resistance movement at this time. And they're quite liberal compared to other groups that might be called Islamist terrorist groups. So I want to talk more about Hezbollah later, but I just wanted to give some of the history of what happened today, 19 years ago, and what has happened in Lebanon for a long time. And I have seen Christian Lebanese people who are very interested in Israel wiping out as many of the Shiites and the Palestinians as they can. And so, I don't know, they support genocide, a lot of them, mostly older people. Younger Lebanese Christians are much more open to the Lebanese identity and being a part of a whole that is Lebanon, instead of groups within Lebanon. When the borders of Lebanon were decided and it became a French protectorate, the Christians were favored by the French, and for that reason they have most of the wealth in Lebanon. They also at this time have the lowest population percentage. There's the most are Shiite, the top number are Shiite, and then Sunni, and then Christian. The Taif Agreement, which ended the Lebanese civil war, guaranteed that the power structure of Lebanon would go Christian, Sunni, Shiite. So the president of Lebanon has to be a Christian, the prime minister a Sunni, and the leader of parliament a Shia. So, yeah, I guess that's all I wanted to say, and I will talk about Hezbollah again in a future video, which will probably be all about Hezbollah and some things about Lebanon. Anyway, the number of civilians who were killed in the Sabra and Shatila massacre is close to 3,500, although there are disputes about the exact number. And so we should all take a moment to remember the victims of that massacre, which is comparable in size to the number that were killed on September 11th, 2001. And I think that should transcend any political or religious identity, because they were civilians. And that's all I wanted to say. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.